Hello, my beautiful people, and welcome back to my channel. No, I'm just kidding. Let me throw that off to the side. Hello, my beautiful people, and welcome back. In today's lesson, we will be going over Chapter 7, listening, and more specifically, receiving and responding. So we have our little preview here, so let's briefly discuss that for a bit, okay? So first, we're going to talk about listening. What is listening? What does listening entail? We're going to be talking about mindful listening, mindless listening. So that's all for one. Two, we're going to be talking about components of listening, very similar to the perception process. Remember, we talked about the perception process, not perception checking, but the perception process. You're going to kind of notice an overlap between some of the elements associated with listening. So there's that for number 2. Check. Number 3, we are going to be talking about listening styles. Number 4, listening barriers. Those are fun. It's one of my favorite sections. Number 5, core listening habits. Those are fun to talk about as well. And then 6, the different types of listening responses. Okay, so I do have my little PowerPoint up here. This is my first time using Zoom and having the PowerPoint up with it. So if you see me struggling, that is probably why. I also have my little notes over here just to kind of make sure that I'm on task so that I just don't have like an hour-long video for you all, because I know that you're going to be pausing throughout the video and taking notes. So I'm going to try my best to kind of go through the material and stay on task as much as possible, just so that you're not sitting here for 2-3 hours trying to go through, pause, take notes, trying to go through, pause, take notes, because on top of this, you have other assignments for the module due as well. So there's that. But these are what we are going to discuss for Chapter 7. So let me go ahead and, what did I do? Okay. Okay, so we will share some content. We're going to do our Microsoft OneDrive. We're going to do attachments. Chapter 7. Where did Chapter 7 go? Oh, there we go. Okay. It should hopefully pop up right now. And boom, okay? And there's your journal entry that you will have. I can't really, for some reason, it doesn't show me along with the PowerPoint, so I hope that I'm in view. Again, trial and error here, okay? But we have our journal entry. So these are items that I want you to think about while we go over the chapter, but this is something that I would normally have you write about before we even start discussing the course-related content, but let's go through it briefly. So would you consider yourself a good listener? Why or why not? How often do you find yourself tuning someone out? I hope you're not doing that right now. All right. Is it because they're boring, unrelatable, ignorant, or does it typically happen when you're tired, hungry, irritable, or just in a bad mood? If you do consider yourself a good listener, how do you demonstrate competent listening behaviors? So in a sense, how do you know that somebody is listening to you? So we're going to be talking about core listening habits and behaviors, and you're going to find, I know that I've found that I do partake in some of these core listening behaviors, and I'm sure many of you have as well when we go over them. But how do you know that somebody is listening to you, right? Do you always give someone else your undivided attention? And how do you know whether or not you are listening to the person? And I know sometimes you're just like wandering off, and maybe you start counting like the ceiling tiles, and then you start thinking, oh shoot, I need to be listening to my instructor, or I should be listening to my significant other, right? So how do you know you or somebody else is listening attentively? Okay, and that's something we're going to address more so towards the end. All right, so these are questions that I want you to answer within your journal. So let's move on, shall we? Oh no. Oh, I think this is the PDF version. Okay, that should be fine. All right, that's fine. Okay, so let's go through, let's write all this information down, but also let's practice listening attentively to Cecilia as well. So what even is listening? Listening, it's the process of receiving and responding to others' messages. So again, it's kind of like a back and forth. It's not like me going to a wall and trying to start a conversation with a wall, right? It goes back and forth. You're not only receiving information, but you're also responding to it in some sort of meaningful way, right? Whether it's nonverbal or verbal, very similar to communication in itself, right? When we talked about that earlier on in the term, it goes back and forth. So next we have listening versus hearing. So hearing is a physiological process where sound waves hit your eardrums, okay? Listening, on the other hand, it's an active process where you're taking in information in a sense. So can we hear something without listening, and can we listen without hearing? Right? You can hear something but not listen to them, right? You can hear something without listening to them. Like, for instance, hopefully right now you all are taking notes as you would in class, but are you always listening to me or other instructors when you're going through and you're taking down notes? You could probably hear me in the background, maybe, right? Some of you aren't even taking notes, which I've noticed, and you're just listening to what I'm saying so that you can kind of absorb the information. Everyone learns differently, of course, but for some of you, you can hear me, but you're not necessarily listening attentively to what is being said, okay? So following hearing and listening, we have mindless listening. So mindless listening, it's reaching or it's reacting to others' messages automatically and routinely. So for instance, if you're talking to your friend, you're having a conversation with them, or they should be listening to you, right? And then they're kind of just sitting there, they're nodding their head, and then you're done with your story, you're done with what you've said, and then they respond with, "Oh man, that's crazy." I've been there. That feels so, it gets a little frustrating at times because you don't feel like that other individual is attentively listening to you, right? They're more so responding routinely, and they're just, I've listened to people, like, for instance, I've listened to my parents on the phone, and maybe they're talking to my sister, or they're even talking to me and I'm telling them a story, and all they're responding is, oh, no way. Oh, really? Right? That's mindless listening. Now, what the majority of the chapter covers is mindful listening. This is something that we do want to practice. So mindful listening, in opposition to mindless listening, is giving careful and thoughtful attention and responses, right? And we're going to talk about the different response styles as well, but you're actually paying close attention to what is being said. Right? It's not just going over your head. You're not just pretending to listen, and we're going to talk about pseudo-listening in a bit, but you're actually paying attention to what is being said, and this is something that we want to practice, not only within this class, but of course in our relationships. So going back to that question that I originally asked, what constitutes good listening behaviors? All right? So how many of you would consider yourself good listeners, right? Some of you are like, yeah, Cecilia, no, Cecilia, I'm kind of somewhere in between. It depends on my relationship with that person. It depends on the context, okay? So what I would like for you all to do is just close your eyes. And I know we are virtual, we are online. It is a YouTube video or it is a Zoom video. Close your eyes. It's going to be weird. Yes, close your eyes, right? So I want you to answer the question, right, that I am asking you out loud. Right? So whatever I ask you, just respond out loud with your answer, right? So close your eyes. What does R-O-A-S-T spell? Roast. Okay, what about C-O-A-S-T? Coast. What do you put in a toaster? Toast. Ah, ha, 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 ha. No. You open your eyes. Yes, no, you do not put toast. You put bread, okay? Now close your eyes one more time. Now you see what we're doing. Close your eyes one more time, okay? Close them. I see you. Close your eyes. All right. If I take 2 apples from 3 apples, how many apples do I have? What did you say? Huh? Did you say 1? Did you say 2? Did you say 3? What? Right. If I take 2 apples from 3 apples, how many apples do I have? 2. Okay. So again, listening is a skill. It is something that we can enhance. It's something that we can be better at. And the same when it comes to public speaking, the same when it comes to communication, the same when it comes to listening. Listening is a skill, and it's something that we can all become better at in a sense. So listening is actually the communication skill that we do the most frequently in comparison to reading, in comparison to writing, in comparison to speaking. We actually listen more often than we do any of those other activities. So think about when you come to school, right? When you drive to school, are you typically speaking with someone or are you listening, right? Majority of you would probably be like, oh, Cecilia, I actually drive in the car with somebody else, but we listen to podcasts, we listen to music, right? Some of you might sit there and you might actually talk with the individual who you're driving with. That's completely normal. That's completely fine. But really think about how much of your day is spent speaking, writing, right? and listening, right? Majority of your day is typically spent listening. Like if you were sitting listening to me at 8 in the morning, right? Sometimes students will respond to my questions, but the majority of a 3-hour-long class, you're listening to me. That's a huge chunk of your day as well. 3 hours of your time, right? Even right now, you're listening to me. You're taking down notes, right? Majority of the time is not spent speaking or writing. Y'all have to write and take down some of these notes for your exams and whatnot. But majority of your time is spent listening. It's a skill we can all enhance and be better at. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about the components associated with listening. So first we have hearing, second attending, 3 understanding, 4 remembering, and then 5 we have responding. So when we're talking about hearing, right, again, it's a physiological process. So you need to be able to hear in order to attend, understand, remember, and respond. So you need to be able to hear whatever is taking place. 2, attending, very similar to the perception process. We're selecting bits of information. There's information that might stand out a little bit more. For instance, again, if you're in a huge lecture hall or if you're in a classroom, typically the instructor or your professor is the one who is speaking, right? If everyone is talking, if we're in groups, it might be a little bit more difficult for you to really listen to your professor or listen to your instructor because there's a lot going on, right? You're attending to the different messages. You might be attending to the individuals who are sitting in your small group with you just because you can actually hear them, right? So first you have hearing, then you have attending. So after you've attended to a message, now is understanding the message. And this is when we assign some sort of meaning to it. Again, very similar to the perception checking process, right? We are in some way, shape, or form trying to attach some sort of sense or meaning to it. So then 4, remembering. Now, this can be a very difficult task to do, all right? Have you ever had a partner, a friend, mom, dad, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, cousin? They tell you a bit of information, and then 1 day, 2 days, 3 days later, they kind of remind you of the information, and you're like, you never told me that. And then they look at you and they're like, yeah, I did. You don't remember? And some people will get a little bit upset with you because you don't remember the information. And it's kind of interesting because our textbook talks about a couple of studies, but one that really stuck out to me had to do with how much information we tend to remember as individuals. So people generally remember about half of what they hear right after they hear it. So y'all are going to be watching this video. Let's say it is 40 minutes long. Right? You may only remember half of the material if you're just sitting there listening to it. And of course, that's not the same across, like, for everyone, right? Again, we have different styles of learning as well. I know some individuals who could literally read through a textbook and remember everything word for word. And I'm like, oh, shoot, I wish I could learn like that, right? And everyone listens differently as well. And we'll talk about the different styles of listening, but for the most part, y'all remember half of the information that you are given. And so again, it's a skill, it's something that we can enhance. Next, number 5, we have responding. And there's different ways that we could go about responding. They could be both verbal or nonverbal. So just shaking your head kind of in agreement, right? Just because someone shakes their head, does that mean that they are listening, right? We are hopeful that they're listening, but typically when someone responds out loud, right, you can tell whether or not they're listening. And think about how, okay? And again, towards the end, we talk a little bit more about the responses that we might receive and how we do or do not know whether or not someone is actually paying close attention to what is being said. But for the most part, you need to hear, right? And then after hearing, you attend to a message, you select something, you understand it, you need to remember it, and then you in some way, shape, or form respond back to it, whether it is verbal or nonverbal, right? So now that we talked about the different components of listening, let's move on, yes? Let's talk about the listening styles, okay? So first we have task-oriented. So some of you might listen to get something done, right? So task-oriented, you're trying to accomplish some sort of task. So think about at work when you're talking to your manager, right? They call you over and they're like, hey, Jennifer, I need you to stock the shelves. I need you to clean out the storage space. And I need you to count the money later on tonight, right? They're kind of telling you what to do, and you're not necessarily listening to bond with them. You're not listening to have some sort of great relationship with them afterwards. You're listening because they're giving you some sort of task at hand, and you're trying to accomplish what they're asking of you. So you're listening in a sense to complete something. 2, we have a relational, and this is a little bit more, in my opinion, sentimental in nature, right? You're not just listening to complete something or to have some sort of immediate response on hand. Instead, when it comes to relational, you're building emotional closeness, right? And typically the individuals who are a little bit more relational when it comes to their type of listening style, they're a little bit more extroverted, they're a little bit more attentive, and they're a little bit more friendly. Does this mean that you are always relational, or that you're always analytical, or that you're always critical, or that you're always task-oriented? No. Again, it depends on the context. It depends on your relationship with the other person. But typically when it comes to relational listening, right, you want to, in some way, shape, or form, build an emotional closeness with them. Okay, that's what relational is all about, right? Can you see the difference, though, between task-oriented, you're just trying to complete something, versus relational, it's more so centered on your emotions, their emotions, right? And then number 3, we have analytical. All right. So when it comes to analytical, we want to attend to full message before coming to judgment, wide range of perspectives. So there's a difference between critical and analytical. And I know that they kind of sound very similar in nature. So again, analytical, you're trying to see things from different perspectives. When it comes to critical, you're being extremely evaluative of what is being said. So you might, for instance, right, analyze some of the examples I've provided. Whereas with critical, right, you're evaluating the examples, and you're either maybe deeming them as good, bad, right, or wrong in a sense. And when it comes to critical listening, right, we're not just taking in information to understand it, right, and see things from different perspectives, but we are evaluating it, and we are making sense of it by I don't know, I don't want to misspeak, but you're evaluating the message. Like if you're listening to a debate, for instance, or if you're listening to a persuasive speech, for instance, you're not just listening to understand. Like you're listening to understand the material, you're listening to understand the messages. When it comes to critical listening, you're evaluating what is being said. So if you're listening to a candidate within the presidential election, right? You're thinking, that's accurate, that's inaccurate. Oh, I need to research that. I don't know how true that is. Let me look up those statistics, right? You're being more critical opposed to analytical, opposed to relational, opposed to task-oriented. And so again, it's not just one or the other. Just because you find yourself a little bit more relational when it comes to your listening behaviors, it doesn't mean that you don't listen task-oriented, you don't listen to be analytical, you don't listen to be critical. It could depend on the context. Like if you were taking a public speaking class, right? You would want to be critical when listening to a persuasive speech. You would want to be critical when listening to a debate that's taking place, right? You're evaluating the message, you're deeming it right or wrong, accurate or inaccurate, okay? You're not just taking it to learn and absorb the information, okay? But can you see the difference between the 4? All right. And again, there might be a crossover between them. It might not just be one or the other, because, hey, maybe your boss tells you what to do, but then they also say, hey, look, I've had a rough weekend. And then you start conversing with them, and then you start listening a little bit more relationally opposed to task-orientedly. Okay. So again, there's kind of like that gray area where it's not all black and white. Not each one of these are like in their own little boxes. There can be a crossover between the different types of listening styles. Okay. So moving on, we have listening barriers. Okay. These are always fun. So we have the listening barriers. So first we have information overload. So have you ever had a professor or a teacher where, like with mine, you can see the PowerPoint, you could see, like, for the most part, this is information overload, personal concerns, right? There's key points that we are going to address. This is the information that I really want you to know. And then there are some professors, maybe the whole PowerPoint, it just has a bunch of information. It's like a huge paragraph, and they want you to go through and write it all down, right? And it's just too much information in one. I always felt that way whenever I took math classes, and it wasn't for every single math instructor that I had, but I just felt completely overwhelmed because it was just too much information at once. Even when I did the readings, it was hard for me to really grasp the material. And so it was just way too much information. They spoke like at 100 miles per hour, and I just felt like it was just too much, and I would get completely overwhelmed. And so for some of you, that may be this class. I hope not. But for some of you, it might be a class like this. It might be a math class. It might be a science class that you take where it's just way too much information, right? And then that prevents you from listening, right, mindfully, because it's just too much to take in. So there's information overload. Then we have personal concerns. So if something is going on in your life, if you're stressed, if you're struggling, if you're tired, right? And I mean, tired kind of goes more so with internal noise, but if you have a lot going on in your life, if you just had a fight with your parent or a fight with your significant other, you're not going to be so much focused on your boss telling you kind of what to do. You're probably not going to be so much focused on what I'm trying to tell you, right? In response to like all of the material. Instead, you're more so concerned with what's going on with you. And there's nothing wrong with that. I know that I felt that way sitting in a class before too, but if you have a lot going on, that can definitely be a barrier between yourself and listening attentively to the speaker. So next we have rapid thought. Our minds are so active, right? So active in that we kind of try to fill in the gaps. So have you all heard that our attention span is like shorter than that of a goldfish? And it's just because there's just so much going on in our brain. It's so active, and we kind of just want to fill in those gaps again, like I said. So then we start thinking about other things. We maybe think about, oh, what am I going to eat tonight? Oh, look at all of those words and such, all of the tiles on the ceiling. And so your mind is kind of just going at 100 miles per hour, and then you're like, oh, shoot, I'm listening to this lecture. Okay, now I need to rewind this video, for instance, right? You just have so much going on. And so next, after rapid thought, we have noise. And this is, again, something that we talked about in chapter 1. We have internal noise and external noise. I don't want y'all to have to sit in through this again, but remember, if, like, for instance, somebody's drilling outside, that would be external noise. It's going to be difficult for you to listen attentively to me. If there's a bunch of disruptions taking place, if people are screaming, if people are like slamming doors, it may be difficult for you to focus a little bit more on what I'm saying. And then we have that internal noise where maybe, again, it kind of goes with personal concerns, but maybe you haven't eaten anything at all today, or you're really stressed out about work. That can also be physiological, psychological, and that's more so internal, right? So internal noise, anything that takes place within; external noise, anything that's taking place outside of you, but it's, again, impeding the flow of information. It's impeding the ability to understand and really mindfully listen to a message. All right, so now that we've talked about listening barriers, let's talk about poor listening habits. All right, pseudo listening is one of my all-time favorite poor listening habits, because I like, of all of them, I know that I have definitely exhibited stage hogging. I've definitely exhibited ambushing. I've done these things as well, right? But pseudo listening is my favorite because I know y'all have done it and I have done it, right? So pseudo listening is essentially fake listening. It's pretending to listen, right? And so some of you in classes, for instance, you acknowledge that you're not listening to your professor, but you also don't want to be called on. So what do? Okay? You shake your head, yes, right? You're like, oh, that's interesting, right? Maybe if I make eye contact with you, you lean in a little bit more and you arch your eyebrows. You're like, oh, Or if I ask a question, right, you're like, oh no, right? But you're not actually listening to anything that I'm saying. I used to do that in math classes. I had no idea what was going on. Sine, cosine, tangent, what? Huh? We're like, and then the instructor would make eye contact with me, and I'd be like, oh, I got it. I get it. Good. Right? And so we tend to think of those like leaning in, arching our eyebrows, shaking our head. We tend to think of those as listening behaviors that demonstrate that you are actually being attentive in nature. But when it comes to pseudo listening, right, you're using those behaviors that we tend to demonstrate like responses of attentively listening as pretending to listen. It's kind of sad in nature, right? Because we each have, we've done it without maybe even realizing it as well. But I feel like for the most part, many of us have engaged in pseudo listening where we're aware of not really paying attention to what the person's saying. Maybe we're not interested in what they're saying. Maybe it's boring, maybe it's tedious, but you're pretending to listen using those techniques that you know demonstrate good listening behaviors. It's interesting, isn't it? So, okay, there's pseudo listening. I feel like I've gone in depth about what is pseudo listening. Then we have stage hogging. So these are the people that just love to hear themselves speak. And I know you're probably like, Cecilia, that is you. And no, it is not. I love it when y'all participate, okay? But stage hogging, it's that they're hogging the stage. It's all about them. They're not really being considerate of you. So maybe you do raise your hand in a class and you ask a question or you want to contribute something. And then instead of the professor or the instructor really taking into consideration the message that you're trying to contribute or the question that you're trying to ask, they kind of go over it. And they're like, oh, we talked about that last week, right? And then they kind of go back into what they were saying. So these are the people who just, they love to be heard, they love to speak their mind, and they're not necessarily considerate of you or of the people around them. It's more so about them. They're more so centered on what they want to say in a sense. So if they're stage hogging. Next, we have selective listening. So with selective listening, you are more so, let me look at my notes just real quick. Oh, shoot. Ooh, we're getting through this a lot quicker than I thought. All right. So then responding only to parts of a speaker's remarks that interest you. Okay. So you're only listening for information that interests you. So for instance, we're having this lecture here, and then I use an example about turtles and you love turtles, or I start talking about sloths and you love sloths. And then you just raise your hand and you're like, well, Cecilia, I've been studying sloths for the past 5 years. Did you know? And then you kind of start going off on your own tangent about sloths, but you're only listening to information that you essentially care about, right? So we see this a lot when it comes to conflict, when it comes to having an argument with someone else. They're taking bits and pieces of information that they want to address, opposed to looking at the entire message as a whole, right? They're saying, oh, I want to talk about this, none of that, none of that, none of that. Okay, let me take that bit of information too. All right, so then again, with selective listening, it more so goes back to information and parts that they want to respond back to, right? So moving on, we have filling in the gaps. And so this one can kind of be a little bit tricky. Think about it when you're watching a movie, for instance, and you're on your phone, texting someone, and you miss bits of information. And instead of kind of going back and rewinding it, the information goes over, but you try to fill in the gaps. Right? And that can be the same when it comes to talking with your partner or talking with an instructor. And instead of listening to the whole message, maybe you zone out for a second and you don't want to raise your hand and be like, wait, what did you just say? Right? Instead, you kind of just fill in the gaps and you come up with some sort of information that would fill it in. So in a sense, it's more so manufactured information. It's not, you have no way of knowing whether or not what you're filling in is true or accurate, but you just kind of go in, you put in your own information to kind of make sense of it, right? So that's what filling in the gaps is. So then we have, it says insulted listening, but it's actually insulated listening. So it should be INSULATED. It's insulated listening. So when it comes to insulated listening, it's kind of like the opposite of selective listening. So insulated listening, you're tuning out topics that you'd basically rather not deal with, right? So with selective listening, you're listening for bits of information that kind of like intrigue you. And then with insulated listening, you're like, maybe there's a specific word or certain topics that you don't want to talk about with your significant other. So you read through the message and you're like, no, I don't want to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about that. And that's more so what you're focused on, in opposition to like, oh, okay, I do want to talk about that. I do want to talk about that. I do want to talk about that. Insulated listening, you're like, nope, don't want to talk about that. Don't want to talk about that. Don't want to talk about that. Okay. All right. And we see this a lot within text messaging where people will just respond back to what they want to, right? And that kind of goes hand in hand with selective listening. Insulated listening, selective listening. So selective listening, responding back to bits of information you want to. Insulated listening, like focusing more so on what you don't want to attend to. All right. So then after that, we have defensive listening. Now with defensive listening, taking innocent comments as a personal attack. So this could be something as simple as your partner coming into the house after working all day and then looking around and being like, oh my goodness, the house is a mess, huh? And they say it exactly like that. Oh my goodness, the house is a mess. And then you respond with, oh, are you calling me a pig? Are you saying that I'm dirty? And you're like, whoa, what do you mean? Like, no, I didn't mean it like that. And so again, it's like, it's defensive listening, right? You're taking it as them saying something negative more so about you. And maybe it's the other way around where you've exhibited it with someone else, where you say something as simple as like, yeah, we should probably clean the cars. Like, oh, you're calling me a pig? You're saying that my car is dirty? Are you saying that I'm lazy? Well, I've been busy all day. And you're like, whoa, I didn't mean it like that. I just, the cars are getting dirty sitting outside. It gets kind of windy sometimes. So that's what defensive listening is. And then last but certainly not least, we have ambushing. So with ambushing, you're kind of looking for bits and information so that you can ambush them. I know, right? That's probably the worst definition, but listening to collect and attack a speaker. So again, you're taking bits of information, very similar to insulated listening, right? There's information that you really don't want to talk about. And with ambushing, you're taking bits of information, but now you want to attack what the speaker is saying. So we see this a lot, again, within debates, right? Where they're listening for information so that they can be like, oh, okay, let me look at that source. Oh, well, the source that you used is inaccurate. Did you know that in 1992, right? So they're trying to attack their opponent in a sense. This can be very hard on a relationship if you tend to do this, if you're listening to ambush the other person instead of listening to understand, right? Or listening for relational satisfaction. You're taking in bits of information because you want to attack them. That's not going to lead somewhere. What I don't know about you, but I don't ever see ambushing or really any of these as something that is going to be beneficial to you and your relationship in a sense. So I don't think think about how would any of these be positive within any type of relational scenario? I don't see it. I know with pseudo listening, you might see it as something positive because maybe you've had a rough day, but then you kind of just be like, okay, let me just shake my head and smile, make the professor feel good. But overall, it's not contributing to a healthy relationship, especially when it comes to your partner, especially when it comes to your brothers, your sisters, the people that you hold close and near and dear to you, and the people that you want to have good communication with. Ambushing, filling in the gaps, even pseudo listening, it's not going to contribute to a healthy relationship because you're not actually communicating with that other individual. They may not feel like they're being listened to. And I mean, with selective listening, for instance, you're taking in bits of information, but they feel like, I know I've sent long text messages before, and then the other person only responds back to what they want to respond back to, but you still have questions about those other items that you wanted to discuss with them. So again, any of these, if not most of these, they don't contribute to a healthy relationship. So we want to talk about listening habits that do help us within our relationship. And that's what we're going to kind of jump into next. So types of listening responses. So this is kind of how we know that someone else is actually listening to us, right? And again, there's pseudo listening, pretending to listen, and we acknowledge that these behaviors, whether they be verbal or not nonverbal, they exist in helping us pretend like we're listening. But let's look at things that we can do to make the other person feel like they're their contributions matter, that you actually care about what they are saying and you're responding to them in a meaningful way as well. All right. So there's different types. I believe, let me see. There's, ooh, my notes are a little bit messy. I believe there's 7. So first, let's talk about silent listening. And we're going to go over these very quickly because I know that you all have engaged in them. So what is silent listening? Staying attentive without verbal feedback, right? You don't necessarily need to ask questions. You don't necessarily need to say, yeah, yes, Cecilia, right? Majority of you in class, for instance, you're sitting there and maybe you do shake your head yes a couple of times, and I'm hopeful that you're listening and you're not like pseudo listening, right? But you're sitting there and you're attentively listening to what is being said without really saying much. And can you exhibit some sort of nonverbal communication to demonstrate that you're listening silently? Yeah, of course you can. So silent listening, staying attentive, you're not really saying much, you're not really asking any questions, you're not really saying anything about what they are saying, right? You can sit in a class, for instance, and silently listen and be attentive without really saying anything and leave the class feeling like you learned a lot, okay? So moving on. So there's silent listening. Then we have questioning. So just asking for further information. And when it comes to questioning, there's sincere versus counterfeit questions. For instance, maybe you're asking a question to clarify the meaning or to learn about their thoughts or their feelings. Like, oh, how did that make you feel? Right? What happened next, right? You're asking questions so that you can gather more information or you can get a sense of how they were feeling or what was going on. So there's questioning, and that's a little bit more sincere in nature. And then there's counterfeit questions, such as asking a leading question, right? So a leading question would be something like, oh, you didn't like that movie, huh? Right? You're already, in a sense, giving their response instead of asking what was your perspective on the movie, right? You're leading it and saying, you didn't like the movie, huh? Right? You're already giving them their answer. So there's that. So asking more sincere questions opposed to counterfeit questions, very important in creating a comfortable climate where the other person feels like, hey, I'm communicating, they're listening to me attentively, but then it can kind of go back and forth. It's not just you kind of just sitting there, because silent listening, honestly, it can get boring over time, right? I like the actual traditional classroom environment because we can go back and forth, but with a platform like this, right, we can't necessarily go back and forth unless we're using Zoom and unless we are doing maybe an asynchronized meeting, or we have a meeting set, me and you, and we could go back and forth. So there's sincere versus counterfeit. Let's move on. Okay, so then we have paraphrasing and restating what you thought the sender meant. So you're paraphrasing it, you're putting it into your own words, right? And sorry, I'm getting a little tired now. Okay, so when it comes to paraphrasing, you're putting your own take on it, right? You're like what you do with essays, for instance. You're not always quoting word for word what that individual is saying. If you're just repeating what that person said, right, that doesn't necessarily demonstrate that you're listening to them. But when you kind of put your own spin on it and you put your own words and you put your own understanding, in a sense, towards what they were saying, that does demonstrate what was being said. So for instance, if after this I asked you to write a paragraph of what was discussed, which I'm not going to, but imagine if I did, but a paragraph of what we discussed in this chapter, it wouldn't make sense to me. Oh, paraphrasing, restating what you thought the sender meant, right? But not saying that exactly, but maybe using examples that I used, but again, putting your own spin on it, putting your own words into play, not just quoting word for word what that individual said, what I said, right? So there's paraphrasing. Then we have empathizing. And again, this goes more so towards the emotional aspect of communicating and listening. So showing that you identify with a sender. So putting yourself in the other person's shoes, in a sense. So would you all want me to, well, we haven't gotten to like responding critically, but we did talk about critical listening. And so majority of you, if you do have something going on in your life and you reach out to me, you reach out to Cecilia and you're like, hey, this is going on. you'd probably want me to listen and respond more so empathetically rather than critically, right? You don't want me to be evaluating your message like, oh, how true is this bit of information, right? Are you lying to me? No, instead, you probably want me to be like, oh, okay. Oh, I understand that you're going through this hardship. That must be very difficult for you, right? You're taking into consideration the other person's feelings, opposed to with critical, you'd be like, how true is this bit of information? Can you send me some sort of documentation that demonstrates, right? So that would be a little bit more critical in nature. Empathizing, you're looking more so at the emotional element. You're taking into consideration that person's emotions, okay? So there's empathizing. Then number 5, we have supporting. All right, so it reveals the listener's solidarity with the speaker's situation, and that can include affirmative messages. For instance, it makes the other person feel not necessarily valued, but like you care about what they're saying. So there's different types of supportive responses. First, you could be in agreement with what they're saying. Like if you just finished an exam and you go out with your friend and you're like, oh my goodness, that exam was difficult. And then they respond with, yeah, it was a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be, right? They're agreeing with you. They're supporting the message that you delivered. So there's agreement. 2, offers to help. Let's say you're moving out and you're disclosing that to your friend. You're talking about how stressful it is to move out and you only have a week or 2. And then they offer to come and help you pack a couple of items, right? Offers to help. 3, we have praise. So for instance, yeah, the boss is kind of being a little bit harsh, but I think that you did a really great job, right? Letting the other person, like that's affirmative in this sense. Those are affirmative messages, letting them know you're doing a great job. So there's praise, and then we have reassurance. Okay, and so letting the other person know like, hey, you might be having a difficult time, but you're doing a really great job. And you can kind of see an overlap between that and praise, but you're letting them know like, hey, everything's going to be a-okay. You're doing a good job. Then we have diversion. And so let's say your friend is going through a very difficult time. Instead of specifically responding back to what is taking place, you might want to get their mind off of it and be like, you know what? You're going through a lot. Like, let's try to get your mind off of it. Let's go see a movie. Let's go do this. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not listening to what they're saying, right? There are instances, I'm sure, where you're like, okay, this person's not listening to me, and they are implementing diversion in a negative sense. But sometimes your friends, they are trying to be supportive, and they're trying to say, okay, look, I know that you're going through this hardship, and it goes back to emotion, right? It goes back to empathizing with you in a sense, but they're trying to let you know, hey, you need to get your mind off of this. Let's go to a party. Let's go get some Diet Coke. Let's go to the store, right? And they're trying to get your mind off of the situation. That's what diversion is, right? So there's all of these different types of ways that you can go about supporting a speaker's message. So then we have analyzing, and see, we have analyzing, and then we also have, where is it at? Oh no, critical zone. Okay, so we have analyzing, evaluating, and then advising left, okay? So we already, in a sense, talked about analyzing. So offer interpretation of the sender's message. Remember, there are different perceptions. And so you're not just sitting there and taking in the bit of information, but you're trying to analyze it, trying to look at it from a different viewpoint. And sometimes I do that when I am reading papers, right? I usually don't read papers one time. I usually read papers 2 or 3 times before I actually assign a grade, because I'm trying to look at it from a different perspective. Because let's say, for instance, I'm really tired, or I'm in a bad mood, or I just had a lot going on that specific day, or even that specific week, right? And so I'll go back through, I'll look at kind of some of the notes that I have, and then I'll try to look at it from a different perspective. So when you're talking with somebody else, for instance, right, think about when you're analyzing somebody's message and you're trying to offer different interpretations of what is being said. And that can include some paraphrasing as well, but you're trying to give your own take on it and not just whatever they said, right? Now you're giving your own take on it, and you're expressing your own views in a sense, right? You're not necessarily trying to fix what their problem is. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but you're trying to give a different take on what is being said. All right, so then we have 7, evaluating, appraise the sender's thoughts or behaviors, and then we have critical versus constructive. So evaluating can be a positive thing, and it can also be a negative thing. And again, it depends on the context, it depends on the situation. But I see the first few items that come to mind would be negative. So, and it's not always negative. I think when we hear the word critical, when we hear the word evaluative, right, we may think of something negative, like when we think about conflict, right? Typically something negative is associated with conflict. When we think about evaluating or being critical, some of you might think of something negative, but that's not always the case. For instance, when I'm listening to presentations, I'm being critical. I'm being extremely critical. And that may not always come across within the notes that I provide, because I try to use we language. Right? We talked about language, but being critical doesn't necessarily fall within a negative realm. So you're not only trying to understand what the speaker is saying, right? Because that's important when it comes to listening in itself. You're not only understanding what the speaker is saying, but you're also evaluating it as well. And then there's a huge difference between being critical and constructive. So with constructive evaluations, within the type of feedback I try to provide, I try to be constructive. So if I do peer evaluations, or if I have other students rate their group members, I ask that, of course, they be critical, they're evaluating other students, but also be constructive in nature. What could they work on, right? Being mindful of the language that you use is really impactful when it comes to constructive feedback. So critical, constructive, they kind of go hand in hand, but they're not necessarily the same thing, if that makes sense. Okay. And then last but certainly not least, we have advising, right? And this is the sad one, because I feel like, I know I've done it, right? Your friend comes to you and they have a very difficult problem. They have a very difficult situation that's taking place. And then instead of you maybe asking questions, paraphrasing the information, listening for emotional support to empathize with them, you provide a solution instead. And again, it depends on the context. It depends on the relationship that you have with that other person. But I think a lot of the time people aren't looking for a solution. And there's no, like, I'm not going to use any type of data or studies to support that idea. But I've just personally found in my own relationships that a lot of the time people just want to be listened to, you know, especially if you're going through a hardship, if you're going through a hard time. It's nice to be listened to. It's nice to feel like you're being appreciated. You have those affirmative messages as well. But people aren't always looking for a solution. But on the other end, sometimes we are looking for a solution. All right. But I mean, I know I kind of just contradicted myself, but sometimes people are actually looking for a solution. So there are those instances where they just kind of want to just let it out. They want somebody to listen to them. And then there are the other times where they're like, hey, what do you think I should do? Right. And listen for that. Does somebody actually ask you, like, what should I do? What do you think? Are they actually asking you that? Are they actually asking for advice, right? Do they want you to advise them in a sense? So providing some sort of solution, just being mindful of the context, the situation, your relationship with the other person, it makes a huge difference in the responses, because not one response always advising someone. For instance, if you find yourself constantly telling your friends, this is what you should be doing, I really ask you to be self-reflective, okay? Because I remember when I took this class and I went through all of these and I was like, okay, I usually am pretty empathetic in nature, showing that you identify with the sender. And that doesn't necessarily always, and I know for a lot of people, like, they like to express themselves, they like to feel their emotion, but for some people, that's not what they're looking for when they come to me or when they come to you. They may just be needing you to listen silently to what's taking place. They may just need you to kind of ask questions and kind of, in a sense, have that conversation with them without really putting your take on it. And they may not even be asking for you to advise them either. So again, it depends on the context. It depends on the situation. Which style do you tend to use within your life, right? And like, for instance, again, if you're always providing a solution, are the people that are in your life always asking for a solution? Or maybe do you think that they just need somebody to talk to? They maybe need somebody to be critical of them, or they need somebody to just be empathetic, right? So again, think about the styles that you tend to use. There is an overlap between them. Remember, not everything is black and white, but there is kind of an overlap between them. So think about it. Which style do you tend to use? And is it always appropriate depending on the context? So one last bit that I'd like for us to take a note of, right, is that most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. I'm sure many of you have heard this quote before, and going back to like my feelings, right? I do feel like a lot of people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. I've even found myself doing this within teaching, right? None of us are perfect. We are all human beings. We all make mistakes in our relationships. We all make mistakes when it comes to communication, but it's making sense of these concepts, right? Seeing, like, understanding what these concepts are. And a majority of you are probably like, a lot of this is common sense, Cecilia, but these are actual words and concepts, right, that hold some sort of merit, they hold some sort of meaning, and you can, for the most part, implement them within your day-to-day life. I'm sure many of you have been so far going throughout the term thinking, oh, there's a word for this, right? There's a word for like using your face, right, to communicate. There's a word for time in communication, chronemics, right? And these words, they exist, right? They're concepts that exist, but think about how you can apply them in your day-to-day life. Think about how you can use these terms, use the different styles that we discussed. Try your best to be self-reflective in what we're learning in this class and how you can enhance your communication with the people who really matter the most to you. So most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Again, it's just being self-reflective, realizing like, hey, these are things that I need to work on. And that's why I took a public speaking class, because I knew that was something that I needed to work on, right? I wasn't very comfortable in front of a group of people. That's something that I need to work on. So if you find yourself not really listening, if you're not listening to me right now, that's not a good thing. But if you don't find yourself listening very attentively within your interpersonal relationships, for instance, look at what we talked about today. Think about what you can do to enhance that communication between yourself and your loved ones, the people who matter most to you. Also within your jobs, within classroom dynamics such as this, what can you do to better yourself, to better these skills so that you can be the best version of yourself possible? All right, so today we talked about quite a bit. All right, we talked about listening, factors associated with listening, components of listening, listening styles, listening barriers, poor listening habits, and then types of listening responses. I hope that this chapter sits well with you. It's one of my favorite chapters just because a lot of the poor listening habits many of us have engaged in, right? So please look at all of the other module activities and module assignments, and I will see you all in the next one. All right, have a good one.